Hey, so I was kind of gonna open this with a bit of a fun Stardew Valley thing before getting into a hypothetical question about who Jesus would hang out with, but then these sorts of posts started coming up. And I think it's important that we discuss how we as Christians should respond when the government does things that aren't necessarily right. So, welcome to a very special episode. So I've put up Romans 13. I'm just going to read out some of the really key parts. If you want to read the entire passage, feel free to pause the video and do so. If you just don't feel like using much of your time, because your time is very valuable, as I understand, because you've got to play Minecraft sometime. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. It is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. There's some pretty strong and explicit stuff in that passage, but the thing that's interesting is we see in Daniel 3 the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Rakshak and Benny for all you VeggieTales fans, in which these three guys directly disobey the governing authority, and God says, yeah, that's what you should have done. So how do we balance this idea of being instructed to follow authority while also being given an example of people standing up against authority and being commended for it? The two things that we're really going to be breaking down today are, first, the context of the book of Romans. Who was it being written to? What was the context at the time? And the second thing is, how might we be able to read this passage considering what happens in the story of Rakshak and Benny? The book of Romans was written to the church in Rome. Paul wrote this letter. The thing that's interesting is that the person in charge of Rome at the time was Nero. I don't know if you know a lot about Nero, but he worked with his mum to kill her husband so that he would be the next heir to the empire. And then he went and had his mum killed so he would just rule the empire without anyone else being able to tell him what to do. This guy was not the most well-liked ruler in the world for some strange reason. And it was no secret that the Romans weren't super fond of the Christians. The Jews weren't fond of the Christians either. Essentially, the church in Rome is in a position where nobody likes them. And this instruction to obey the authorities is basically Paul saying, you guys are the start of the church. Fighting about paying taxes isn't a fight worth having. You're meant to be there as a group to show people God's love. That means obeying the laws that are kind of silly because Nero's insane. He's a psychopath. He's just gonna kill you if you do anything that suddenly questions his role as leader. And given that we're talking about Jesus as the forever king, that's something that a ruler is going to be scared of. Already, they're going up against Nero, so they've got to toe the line in every other regard, so Nero doesn't see them as a threat. The thing that's interesting is verse 8 says, let no debts be outstanding towards one another, except that of love. Always outdo each other in love. That's what they're being told to do. And this sort of ties in with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because the three of them are given a choice. Love God or obey the authorities. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are like, the number one thing we're called to do is love God, and we can't be loving God and following that law. And it's worth noting that God sends an angel to save them from the fire. So presumably this act of defiance against the ruler was something that God wanted them to do. But that is not submitting to the authorities like Paul talks about later on. So it's simply not possible that Paul is meaning every single law is a law that should be followed. The question is, where is the line at which point we are called as Christians to stand against a decision made by the government? And more importantly, what form should that take? All that we're told is the two most important commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbour as much as you love yourself. If there is a law, or there are decisions being made by the government that make it impossible to do these two things, then we are called to focus on love. Kind of like in the Mother's Day video when I talked about like the 2 times it's okay to stand up to your parents. Is what I'm being told to do stopping me from loving God or loving others? Because if it is, that is when you do something. But how does responding with love look like? And that's something that you're going to have to figure out. I can't tell you that. I can just point you to the Bible, might touch together with electrical tape, and tell you that we know what God wants of us and who God is from this. So how does that impact who we are?